I am here today to review Vampires Today, The Truth About Modern Vampirism by Joseph Laycock. If you were involved with the online vampire community in the mid-2000s to the early 10s, you probably at least heard about this book. There was a lot of talk in some corners about how there was a serious, scholarly book being written about the community and how that could potentially parlay into more mainstream recognition for the study of the vampiric condition. In retrospect, this did not happen, and the mainstream did not seem to take notice, even with the provocative cover photo used. That said, I did enjoy this book for the different perspectives on familiar material and for the trip down memory lane. The book begins with the most important and obvious question for anyone that has ever bothered to dip into the vampire community. What is a vampire? After an examination of what vampires are as per the community of the time and what vampires are in folklore, along with the associated questions it asks of the human condition, it then delves into what Laycock calls the vampire milieu, which is like the combination of all vampire folklore, pop culture, and associated tropes up until that point. Around this point, the author touches upon one of the more interesting aspects of the vampire community, and that is the awakening model versus the initiatory model of vampirism. This book was first published in 2009, and I can say at that point the predominant opinion in the online community was that vampirism was an intrinsic aspect of a person's nature and not something that you could become. You were perhaps awakened to it, but you were not made a vampire. This is the awakening model, and it is interesting to see how this mode of being has evolved across multiple groups and communities that focus on self-identification to be a part of their in-group. The initiatory model was relevant to more magical or esoteric vampire groups that believed vampirism was something you did as part of a spiritual praxis, but initiation was not necessarily exclusive to these groups. The end goal of initiatory groups was often immortality, either by appeasing some vague and nameless undead or spiritual vampire gods above you, or by learning the techniques that allowed you to literally cheat the final death of your astral body after your physical death. Laycock's discussion of this dichotomy actually spurred me to think that even back in 2009 and before, that what we had in the vampire community was actually a combination of these two modes. Even if one came to the community as an awakened vampire, there was still a sort of initiation you had to go through. You had to learn the jargon, you had to learn the etiquette, and at least in the online community, once you had mastered this sort of poise and parlance, you were a part of the group. In this same way, there were many people that came into contact with the online vampire community, and this sparked their own awakening. I'll leave discussion and argument about turning and whether these people were real awakened vampires to some other time, but my overall point is that the awakening versus initiation dichotomy isn't much of a dichotomy in retrospect. Switching gears, Laycock proceeds to a history of the vampire community. This specifically relates to the American vampire community because the author was apparently only able to consult with American vampires, and if I'm being honest, we really did kind of have a monopoly on vampirism at that point in time for a variety of reasons. The primary contact seems to be the Atlanta Vampire Alliance, with some other contacts within the Gotham Halo, otherwise known as the New York vampire scene. Because of these limitations, the history is incomplete from an international perspective. I can relate from personal experience that the majority of the online vampire community of the time was also American. The internet was not as widespread yet, and language barriers had yet to be conquered, and this undoubtedly contributed to the limited focus of the history presented in this book. It would be very interesting now, with the further proliferation of the internet, to see non-English speaking communities recording and promoting their own histories, and this has begun to happen to some extent. The author interviewed several prominent people which I've had the mostly pleasure of interacting with over the years in various capacities. I'm not going to name drop because I'm a nobody and don't actually know any of these people aside from forum and chat room interactions, but I will say that in 2009 pretty much everyone mentioned was something of a big deal in the community. Many of them had resource websites or were doing various forms of outreach and support for the VC at the time, and many of them are still active today. The author then moves to examining vampirism as a new religious movement. The caveat here is that while there appears to be no overarching agreed upon rules or dogmas that would otherwise classify vampirism as a religious movement, there still are certain qualities that lend a religious or at least spiritual bent to the vampire community. Those that identify as vampires see it as a core aspect of themselves. For many, it is connected to their religious or spiritual beliefs, and it is deeply incorporated into their personal ontology. Whether we're talking about awakened vampires or initiated vampires, there still an underlying and binding quality of vampirism, a sort of umbrella that everyone can congregate under. Finally, there's an examination of vampirism in the then modern day and stepping out of the shadows and into the mainstream. This sort of happened, but it didn't really matter much in the end. Around this time, the online vampire community was venturing out of our secluded forums and IRC chats and moving to Facebook. This was circa 2011 or so, and about the time I dropped out of contact with the majority of the community. I always found it somewhat ironic that a community partially defined by secrecy would turn to Facebook, of all places, to continue networking and online interaction. Remember that 2009 was at the peak of Twilight Mania, and vampires were very much all the rage. Every Halloween there was a new A&E or Discovery documentary about vampires and real vampires, with the associated figureheads of Michelle Ballinger or Don Henry giving their perspectives. Twilight, True Blood, and the Vampire Diaries define this era. It turns out that the vampire craze wasn't that long-lived, and even the new phenomenon of social media ended up being rather insular, if not actually private. Mainstreaming didn't really go anywhere for vampires in my opinion, but I like to think that some of those ideas have lived on with other fringe communities for better or worse. As for the book itself, I wholeheartedly recommend it to anyone that was or is interested in real vampires, and for anyone that was around back then but didn't read it at the time of publication, like myself. It was a delightful trip down memory lane for me. I think that it could have benefited from another pass by an editor, but there was nothing that distracted very much from the message of the text. As someone that lived through this era of the vampire community, it was a reminder of all the good and bad we had back then, and of how completely different things are now post-Facebook and post-social media in general. For someone that has never interacted with the vampire community before, it may only serve as an interest piece on a strange, spooky subculture, and it works well as that. Who knows, maybe someone finding it now may even find something they didn't even know they were looking for. The book is available on Amazon, but at the time of recording it goes for about $75 US for the hardcover print version, and for some reason the Kindle version is $54. If you can get it used, it will still run you around $35 US, so this is definitely something you'll have to be interested in to track down. And that said, thank you for watching. Until next time.